My name is Brock, and this is the Dungeon Master's Toolkit Podcast.
If you'd like to help us make more content, consider joining the Patreon. You can also bookmark our affiliate links to Amazon and TTRPG to support the show with each purchase. Want a free way to help the show? Give it a review on your favorite podcast platform, or like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Finally, if you'd like to be on the show, or think you know a great guest, contact me on the Discord server or on Twitter. And with that, let's jump into the episode. Hello and welcome everybody. Today I have a bit of a different episode for you. Today's episode is going to be kind of a office hours Q&A type episode, and we are specifically going to be talking about play-by-post games. I've gotten a bunch of questions on play-by-posts, all very good and relevant questions for that style of game. So I'm going to go ahead and take this time to talk about what play-by-post games are. I'm going to talk about some of the things that I found, some pros, some cons, and some ways I have found to kind of mitigate some of the cons of running play-by-post games. And then I'm going to go through and answer the questions specifically. I think a lot of the questions will kind of be answered when I go through the other sections, but we'll go through them one at a time just to double check and make sure I got everything. With that, let's talk about what a play-by-post game is. Play-by-post is kind of like play by email or chess by email, if you've ever heard of that. And essentially, it's where the entire game takes place inside of some sort of a text format. So it could be sending emails to and from a group. It could be on a Discord server, which is a great way to host those now. It could be through text messages, any messenger service really, right? It's basically a play by text method of gameplay. One of the biggest things about this text method of playing the game is that these games tend to be kind of always going, so you don't necessarily have to pick a specific time on a specific week that you're going to sit down for a couple hours with your group to play. These can kind of be like, oh, I have, 20 minutes here. I'm going to go look, see what my character is going to do, type up some dialogue, send back my actions, and then I can wait, right? So I can play 20 minutes here, 20 minutes there, wait for replies from other people. And you can kind of play a lot slower but more consistently because the game just kind of keeps running even when people aren't necessarily together. And it lets people play on their own time, which is one of the biggest benefits. If it's really difficult scheduling wise to sit down and block out a couple of hours each week, each month, whatever, to play an actual session, then play-by-post can be a good alternative. One of the other big benefits I see to play-by-post games is that it gives you a little bit more time to think about what your character would do, or if you are the GM, what the monsters would do, or how NPCs would respond. And this is actually one of the first areas where I started GMing. I don't know if I've talked about that much, but I ran a play-by-post server, a Discord server, for probably about a year, and we didn't get through a lot of content, and we were playing the index card RPG, but it did give me a lot of good practice in just coming up with kind of next steps and kind of learning to improvise as a dungeon master. In a regular game, when you're sitting down with other players, a lot of times, especially as a DM, you've got to think really quickly. And you don't want to sit and think about what your NPC is going to do, what the monsters are going to do for, 5 or 10 minutes every time the players do something, because you would never get anything done and your game sessions would take 7 hours. But with play-by-post, oftentimes, since you're not constricted to a specific time frame, you can see, okay, so-and-so's character did this. Okay, I'm going to think, this NPC, this is what's going through their head. I can type up my response to see what they're going to say. While I'm typing up the response, I might think of something else quick, and I can go and edit and change things. And then I can, give a well-crafted response back to the player. So the slowed down time frame for me is another benefit because it just gives you time to think, both as a player and as a dungeon master. Now, there is one primary con to play-by-post games. I love them. I think they're great when you do them right. But the biggest problem that I've run into is the timing and the consistency of responses in a game, and that can either make or break the game. There are a couple of factors here that contribute to an overall kind of disconnect in timing. So let's go ahead and talk about those. The first one is just going to be kind of an agreement with the rest of the people that you play with. So you're going to have to talk up front when you start one of these games with everybody to say, how frequently do we want people to be responding to this? It could be the case where you play this like a regular session where you dedicate a specific hour or a few hours, perhaps, that everybody knows that they're going to be together at their computer. They're not necessarily going to be on a call doing role playing, but they're going to be in chat. Now, this isn't a mode that I have done, but I believe some people do this. So I think this is probably more of the exception than the rule. But in this case, obviously, you've agreed on a specific time frame that you're going to be playing. Kind of the next phase of that, as you kind of expand that time frame, is to say how frequently, if we're not playing at a specific time, how frequently are we communicating and coming in and checking messages and responding to people and saying what our characters would do. That's when you kind of dedicate or dictate the speed of the game. So if you say we're going to come in and we're going to check 3 times a day and then you have to respond, or maybe you have, a 24-hour window to, respond to the GM with what your character does or whatever, that's great. You want to know that. Obviously, life happens for people, and sometimes people are gone or they get sick or, all of a sudden their internet's down, whatever the case is. Sometimes those deadlines can get missed, and that's where stuff starts to kind of tank. And I think the biggest killer of play-by-post games is when you miss enough of these kind of communication points frequently enough, you start to miss a couple, and then you start to miss more, and then all of a sudden the games just kind of fizzle out. That has been my experience with play-by-post games. So that's the big thing that you want to combat and you want to get rid of, and try to mitigate as much as possible. So first step, be on the same page with your players and if you're the GM, to make sure that everybody knows kind of roughly how they should be playing, how frequently they should be logging in and checking things, and that sort of thing. Now, there are some other factors to this that just kind of make this problem worse, which is kind of why I think this is kind of the main killing point of play-by-post games. So things like initiative will really bog down a play-by-post game, because if we are talking and we're responding and we're all kind of out of order, willy-nilly whenever, and then, okay, combat happens, roll initiative. Well, now everybody's got to roll initiative, and there's always that one person that's like busy or something, and then everybody rolls initiative in like the first like 2 hours, right? And everybody's ready to go. And then one person is at work and they work late, and then they don't ever respond until, super late in the evening, everybody's in bed, and then it's the next day before anything even happens, right? And that's not a situation you want, because that just leads back to that first problem of the frequencies getting off, and then the game just kind of dies, right? The other issue, so initiative is bad. One of the other issues is needing the GM to respond to things frequently. So the GM kind of becomes a bottleneck in that regard, because when you're in a regular game, there's a lot of questions and stuff that get asked of the GM, clarifying questions like, hey, I'm planning on doing this. Is there like this in the room, or is, can I make this jump, or how far away is that thing, right? There's all these, like, your player, as a character, you're trying to kind of see what the character is seeing. And so as a player, you need to ask those questions to be like, I don't have the full picture because I'm not actually there, so I need to ask these clarifying questions. Well, then you bottleneck on the GM. So if the GM has a lot of time and they can respond really quickly, that's great. But if the GM doesn't have a lot of time, or gets delayed, can't respond frequently, you can run into more of those bottlenecks where you are constantly hitting okay, now I said my thing, and now I'm waiting until the GM can respond. And then, especially in combat, things can grind to a halt. And then I would say that one of the last pieces of it is just the system in general. Some systems lend themselves towards play by posts better than others. I have played Dungeon World play by post, and I find that that works much better for play by post than something like D&D 5th edition or anything. Really, it's the Powered by the Apocalypse games, especially ones where there is specific dice rolls where you know that a certain dice roll is going to be a certain outcome, right? So if the GM says, hey, give me a strength roll, I am going to know as soon as I roll that check whether I succeeded or failed. And in Dungeon World and many other Powered by the Apocalypse games, those moves that I'm making when I'm doing those rolls are going to give me options that I will select as a player when the roll happens after I know what the result is. And there's no back and forth needed like in 5th edition D&D, for example, where if the DM says, hey, make a dexterity roll, I rolled a 13. Does that succeed? Does it not? Now I again have to wait for the DM to tell me what happens. I don't even know if I succeeded or not, let alone any of the consequences. So, Powered by the Apocalypse games, I only have familiarity with playing Dungeon World, so I can only speak to that one. But a game like that where it, I got a partial success. Okay, I need to pick this option, and then I also pick a complication. Bam. I pick those things. I kind of narrate it a little bit, and then I send it back to the GM, and then he can tell me the rest of what happens, but at least I can get a little bit more moving. So your system is going to be important. Again, it's all of these factors that lead up to taking down that frequency and bottlenecking it, because when that bottleneck builds up, that's what kills the Powered by the Apocalypse games, at least from what I've found and in my experience. As far as initiative goes, the way that I found to fix that is to just throw initiative out the window completely. I know that sounds probably weird if you're used to playing at like a table, but honestly, just saying, okay, all the players can take their turn whenever they take their turn. There's no initiative. It's just whoever jumps in first, they act first. Just because you're trying to limit the amount of time bottlenecks that you have. Because if 4 people need to go and all 4 of you are waiting on the 5th person that's late at work and can't respond until 11 p.m., then nobody else can take their turn until the next day, right? Let those other 4 people go so that by the time you get to that 5th person, the game is moving, right? And then the GM can respond in between to everybody else as they get time. And then once all of the players have gone, then let the GM run all of the monsters, all the NPCs, whatever. Let them take all of their turns, kind of just flip-flop players, monsters. Again, Powered by the Apocalypse games where NPCs and monsters and GM-controlled characters are more reactive to what the players are doing and what the players are rolling. Again, tends to work a little bit better because you don't necessarily have turns for them. They just do things after the players do things. So it just works out a little bit better. System will make a difference when you're doing a play-by-post game. You can do pretty much any system in play-by-post. You're just gonna, certain ones are just gonna work better than others, and it's up to you to find out which systems are gonna work best for you and your group. I would also say that play-by-post is a good way to test out new systems. To a certain degree, it's not quite a full test, but if you want to just dink around in the system and maybe run a couple of quick scenarios, or you don't really have time to run them, just run it as a play-by-post game on the side, that's great. Another great application for play-by-post is in campaign play, and if you say have some downtime where you're going to be in a town for a while or at a castle for a while or something, and you want to say, hey, you guys are here in this area. Here's tell me what you want to do while we're waiting for the next session to happen, and we'll do some role play in the Discord chat, and maybe make some rolls here and there, find out some new information. That's great. And you can kind of use play by post as a supplement to your actual live games. I'm going to go ahead and read through these questions now, and then after we're done with the questions, I'm going to talk a little bit about platforms or systems that I found useful for running play-by-post games. So our first question is, how do you deal with a conversation between yourself and an NPC? I think this is coming from the perspective of being a player. So being a player and talking to an NPC. I would do this generally as if I was talking to the GM as the NPC, kind of in a live game. Although I might kind of give the GM more hints as to what I'm after. So since it's not going to be like a live conversation of short little, quips back and forth and little sentences, it might be more of like I write out a paragraph and I say like, this is the thing that they're trying to explain. And maybe talk about some body language or whatever too, and just kind of give them a bunch of information to work off of, so that they don't necessarily have to guess. I'm not just saying like yes, no, I would like to do this, right? Like I try to give them a little bit more information, and maybe kind of out of context. I like to put in like parentheses when I'm typing this out in like a Discord server, say like this is kind of what my character is going for when they're asking, so that the GM has a little bit more to go off of than just the exact words that are being said. So the next question is, how do you know when it's your turn to write something down or to say what you're going to do? This kind of goes back to talking with your group. You'll have to decide how you're going to handle kind of initiative and that sort of a thing. If it's just whoever jumps in whenever, definitely going to have to be decided by the group. Because if it is that way, then it would just be, okay, whoever can go, you jump in, you say your thing, GM responds, whatever. Some groups may do strict initiative. I've very briefly played in a Star Wars game that was strict initiative, and you had 24 hours to respond, and if you didn't, you were kicked out of the server, essentially, like permanently banned. And it was so rigid, and I just couldn't keep the pace the right way. I had to drop out because it just wasn't going to work. So that's just definitely something that you want to talk to your group about before you start a session, so you know, how are we queuing people? How do I know it's my turn? I know that's not a great answer, but that's kind of the reality of the situation there. The next question here is really good. What are you actually supposed to be saying in these play-by-post pieces? Are you just talking about what your character is doing? Are you actually talking about taking actions and stuff? A little bit of both. This is up to you and up to your group. Again, as I think all of these questions, there's always that like, well, it depends. But I'll tell you what I do, and I might need to backtrack a little bit here. When I play by post, I lean into the fact that this is a written medium and not it's not a live like acting type experience or like a movie type experience. This is writing, and so when I do play by posts, I tend to write everything out as if you were reading it in a book or a novel or something. So it reads almost like you're reading a book. So I'll say things like, Kirov moves to the side of the door and draws his axe and says, and then in quotes, blah, 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 whatever he says. Right. And then maybe have a little bit of actions or something after that. And then, again, like parentheses at the end. This is what my character is trying to do, right? Make it clear to the GM that this is what I want to do. Now, some people might like that. Some people might not like that. That's up to taste. Again, personally, just because it's a written medium, it's different than a live setting. So I kind of like to narrate it differently than a live game would be narrated. I like it to be readable when you come back to it. That's just me. definitely check with your group to see what they want. If I remember correctly, that Star Wars game that I played in was super super crunchy, and it was like you had to pick what your actions were, and it was almost like a video game. It was so weird. It didn't feel like a role playing game really to me. It was like a video game with all of the worst parts of it basically not being a video game. Next question: when you do combat, how do you determine when you do rolls? Do you wait for a time when you're all together and are able to do combat? Again, depends on what you've agreed on with your group. Personally, for me, kind of back to that initiative thing, I just, whenever, if you were in my group, if you're playing in my game, I would basically just say, hey, we're in combat. Everybody tell me what they are going to do, when they're going to do it, and then we'll just evaluate rolls and stuff as it happens. Other people have strict initiatives. I haven't seen a lot where you necessarily sit down all at the same time to do combat specifically, though if everybody was available, it would go a lot faster. Yeah, check on what your initiative settings are for your game. Next question. I play Fate a lot, and I think about it in the way Fate works. What happens when you use Fate points to change the dynamics of a story? So I'm not super familiar with Fate. I've read it. I've briefly glimpsed it a while ago, so the mechanics aren't super top of mind right now. But I believe when you use a fate point, you can introduce like new pieces of information, or kind of change things in the story. I don't know if it would really, again, comes down to your table. I don't know if it would really, it would probably work about the same way that it works if you were playing a live game. I think it would just be, then it's maybe another bottleneck for the GM. It would go, the GM has to agree to it and whatever. However that works in a live game, I would defer to that. It's going to work the same way. It just might be another touch point where the GM has to come in and, okay, here's what that means now because this fate point was spent. Next question is, what is the frequency of when conversations should be happening? Should it be every day? Should it be once a week? Is it determined by the group? Should it be decided ahead of time? Yes, you've answered your question. You should decide that ahead of time what your kind of like estimated frequency is going to be. I think weekly could work. I would say that like once a day is games that I've played in where there's been at least one response a day by all players tends to feel good. It feels like it's moving along. It might be slow, but it's moving along and it gets a little bit of momentum. Once a week might be harder unless, for fear of it just kind of like falling apart. But some groups, maybe that works really well for them. So once a week could be fine. If you're doing once a week, you're probably going to want to be putting more information into the actions, right? Because again, if it's like you respond once a week and then you have to ask some clarifying questions to the GM, and then it's another week before you get a response, then it was going to be a really slow game. So I guess my recommendation is probably somewhere between 24 48 hours for a response, just to keep some momentum going and just knowing that people get busy. But definitely check that out with your group. And the last submitted question is there a set limit of how much I should post? 100 words, 50 words? That's a good question. I have not experienced a play-by-post that was limited by the amount of words that you can put in. Looking back at some of my play-by-post responses, it seems like most of my stuff is, maybe right around a paragraph or two, probably max. And that's probably a lot. It's actually probably just a handful of sentences. It's probably closer to just a single paragraph. So it's maybe more than you would say if you were in a live game, right? Where you would just say, oh, I move over here and I do this thing, right? It's a little bit more meaty than that. And I'll read some of the recent play-by-post that I've been doing, just so you can get kind of an idea of this. But yeah, it's not it's not a lot. I don't know. You probably don't want to do like pages and pages of responses either, because that kind of takes away from the give and take and the conversation aspect of an RPG. But yeah, I would say that like, a little bit more than like one sentence, but maybe cap it off at about 2 paragraphs, maybe, depending on what you're doing. Oftentimes the like big paragraph chunks are me as the GM setting up a scene and describing what's happening, so I need a little bit more space to do that. But typical like conversations back and forth are there's not a lot to it, so I wouldn't worry about that too much. I would probably worry more about just don't be writing pages because that's probably not going to work super well. All right, that's all we had for questions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Discord and how I have used Discord to run play-by-post games because this is so far probably the easiest platform that I have found. There may be dedicated play-by-post platforms out there. I have not used any of them if they exist. And if you're planning on playing something long term that's play by post, I would recommend that you go check those out and see, because they probably have a lot more specific tools than something like Discord has, because Discord's not really meant for it, but it works. And what I like to do with Discord is, obviously when you're setting up a server, you create like a category or a channel or whatever, or a category to hold all of the like sub channels of that game, right? So if I was running multiple games, I'd probably make multiple separate categories, potentially. And then I also like to make category or channels, so text channels for various different I'm going to say threads, but threads is a thing in here, and I do use those. We'll get to that. So different pieces. So in my play-by-post server, I've got story, characters, obstacles, locations, rules, and then a random. And these are all text channels. And then underneath those, I use threads. So that's a new addition to Discord since I've run a play-by-post game. And it actually helps a lot. I really like it. And so the threads, like the threads under story, it's chapter 1, it's prologue, chapter 1, chapter 2. And then, when we get to kind of a new scene, a new chapter, I'll create a new thread, and then we'll do our text and stuff in there. And so the way that I have it organized is story is where the action is happening. And this is a combination of both narrative, what's happening. It's also the dice bot and the dice rolls that are happening, and and even occasional questions and stuff back to the GM to say like, hey, what is this? What is this? Whatever. Some servers that I have seen will have separate dice channels, so they'll have like their story narrative channel, and then they'll have a separate dice channel and a separate channel for questions. And I kind of understand why they do that, because they want to keep the narrative solid and more like a book. I actually dislike that, even though I like the book kind of reading aspect of it. I dislike not being able to see where roles and stuff are at, because if you put roles back in a channel somewhere, it's really difficult to reference like, okay, I did this thing and then the GM responded and this is what happened, but I don't remember what my result was. And you're never going to be able to go find that specific role that you made, right? So if you have the role right in the same channel, right underneath, like I do this thing, I jump over the ledge, dice roll, bam, there's my result. Okay, so now when I'm reading this back, I can say, oh yeah, okay, I failed that check. Now I'm dangling from the cliff. Okay, yep. To me, it makes it easier, and then you don't have to jump between channels. So I like that as well. It's just easier that way. So that is my preference. That's not everybody's preference. That's again a per table thing. So for characters, I created a thread for each character, and this is the system that I'm doing here is actually a custom system that I'm trying to playtest. And so the character sheets are small enough that they can fit just as text inside of these individual threads. The thing that I like about doing threads in Discord is that when I am making my posts and talking, narratively in the story, you can actually reference these threads by hitting the pound sign and then typing in, like, since the threads are named whatever the character name is, you type in their name and then it'll pop up, and then it'll put it in there as a link back to that thread. So if I have something that says, hey, this person, we're going to name a name, and this guy's name is Elmar. When I put his name in there and I use that pound sign or that hashtag symbol, and I do it on his name, whenever I do his name or any of the characters' names, I use that and reference it back to that thread, because then anytime when I'm looking back through this, it's super easy to just go and say, oh, yeah, what was Elmar's stats again? Oh, I just click on his name and bam, I'm back to what is essentially his character sheet. Or, if you didn't keep a character sheet in here, you could maybe keep a link to the character sheet, and you can maybe have an image of what the character looks like, and notes and stuff like that in there that you can keep, that essentially creates kind of a living document, kind of a wiki style document or linking structure within Discord that'll jump you back to the places that you need to be. Same thing with obstacles, locations. I can take notes on locations, and then whenever I talk about it, I use the hashtag and link it, and then players need to be reminded of what it is. They can just click on it, jumps them back to that spot, and then they have all the information that they need, right? There's probably better solutions than this, but this is just what I have used, and it's worked pretty well. Rules isn't anything special. It's just rules for the game. Random was just kind of a general chat for us to mess around with the dice bot and stuff, out of story stuff. So those are my tips on using Discord for play-by-post. And now let's jump into a reading from one of my recent play-by-post games. This is a Star Wars themed one-shot using a custom system that I'm working on, and it's actually a playtest for that system, so the mechanics may not sound familiar, but bear with that. I'm going to read a short snippet from Chapter 2, and this is the main characters are basically infiltrating a rebel or a Imperial facility and trying to get some information on materials that are being processed there. And their ship is currently landed on this facility. It's kind of an asteroid base, and they're currently trying to dock with one of the ventilation shafts. Elmar puts the ship down on the top side of the asteroid that the facility is built into. The asteroid has a green shine to it, different than most asteroids you've seen before. Not an overpowering color, but a slight forest green tint. There, Sarath says, pointing to the small, metallic-looking section on the asteroid's surface. Elmar moves the shuttle and places it carefully over the metallic section. Everyone needs ventilation, Elmar remarks as he powers down the ship. We'll need to keep power usage to life support only while we're here to make sure they don't pick up the ship's signature. R3DO goes to work extending a special docking piece from the ship over the main exhaust port. The docking tubing makes a small crawl space to the vent where it was pressure sealed around the exhaust port, creating a makeshift airlock. The tubing inflates to its fullest size as various exhaust gases are vented out of the facility. We'll have to move quickly once we seal the airlock, Elmar says. If we plug the exhaust too long, we risk blowing the airlock or having them realize we're here. And then as the GM, I asked the player, is there anything else you want to do on the ship before you jump into the ventilation system? And he says, nope, I'm ready. R3DO engages the airlock. It quickly inflates as the exhaust pressure builds inside the makeshift tunnel. The crew of the Egulus 1718 drop quickly into the ventilation system before remotely releasing the airlock pressure valves. The duct is small, dark, and has a mix of many different smells. It's breathable, however, and warm. As you descend, you find yourself above a small utility closet. The ducts branch out on either side, one branch heading towards the mess hall, the other towards Bay 1. There's a maintenance hatch below that you can use to enter the utility closet. What do you do? And then I have a map of the facility and a section highlighted as to where they're currently at. From the player, Elmar will begin smelling that air to see if he can get a whiff of mealtime or any cooking going on in the hall. Sarath would drop immediately into the closet to see if he can find anything useful. You can never be too prepared for a fight, right, Elmar? Sarath chuckles. Be quiet, Sarath. Surprise is key here, and your yapping will certainly let someone know we're here, Elmar whispers aggressively. Make some type of investigation roll to see if you can find anything useful. That's from me, the GM. And our player decides he's going to use his Infiltrator and Unafraid tags for a +2, rolling 2d6, getting a result of 5. We're doing Blaze in the Dark style, Forged in the Dark dice mechanics here. So that is a partial success. Some kind of pole or long stick that he might use to prop something open or poke around at something dangerous. No reason to get weapons dirty if necessary. As a consequence, I think Sirath is probably making a lot of noise as he rifles through the items in the closet. Niet, tossing junk left and right. As a plus, could Sirath infer anything about the kind of tools they are using based on the material in the closet? So my response, Sirath easily finds a broom. You can even unscrew the end so you have just a pole. There are a bunch of used gloves that seem to be covered in dirt, almost like gardening gloves. With the noise, I think we can start a suspicion timer. Each time you make a commotion, we bump the clock up, and if it fills up, people are going to come looking. And with this, I actually started a timers thread so that I, again, could link that thread back over. So if anybody wanted to check on what the timer was at, we just had to click it and jump back. Elmar, haha, I found a stick. Look. And then what does the crew do next? If Elmar doesn't smell anything too strong coming from the hall, he'll head that way and tell Sirath to follow. Get up here and be quiet. My response, the crew doesn't hear much of a commotion. Must be between shifts, they think to themselves. You make your way into the mess hall, which is mostly empty, save for an Imperial droid doing a bit of cleaning. If it noticed you, it hasn't registered that you don't belong here, either too busy with its work or not programmed to be searching for intruders. What do you do? Elmar would begin to move toward any open doors to see if he hears or sees any activity. Is R3 with us? Sirath would see if there is anything good to eat. What do Imperial pigs eat anyway? Let's find out. My response, R3 is with you. As you move through the mess hall, the faint smell of a finished meal floats softly to you. The Imperial droid you noticed when you entered appears to have just finished picking up the leftovers and has moved on to mopping the floors. You hear the muffled speaking and some light coughs radiating from the door closest to the barracks. The muffled sound was undeniable and distinctly recognizable. Stormtroopers, likely returning to duty in the barracks after the meal. The hall towards the living quarters remains quiet. What do you do? The question was asked, do we have a rough layout of the buildings? Yes, we had a map at the very top. That is one quick snippet here. Having stories in Discord split out into chapters makes it a lot easier to jump around, because if you just keep going and going and going in a single Discord thread or channel, you're going to lose stuff as it continues to get pushed up to the top. So having things split into kind of separate chapters that don't get super long does help with that. And with that, I think I'm going to end our snippet from Chapter 2. If that is something you would be interested in hearing more of this story, let me know. Or more play-by-post stuff in general. And thanks again for asking these questions on play-by-posts. If people are interested in more episodes like this, where I get a bunch of questions and then I can kind of go through them and talk about, my experiences and what my thoughts are on them, please feel free to hit me up on either Twitter or Discord. There's spots in Discord for questions like this, and I love recording episodes like this, so please go ahead and jump on over to the Discord and ask questions.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Dungeon Master's Toolkit podcast. You can find links to all of the products and resources that we talked about on the show in the show notes. And if you'd like to join the community or find out how to be on the show, check out our subreddit or join us in our Discord server.